George Mitchell had not smiled in 4 months. Not a real smile anyway. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there for more than a second. His daughter Emma had been counting. 4 months since her mother passed, 4 months since her father stopped being the man she grew up with, and 4 months of watching him sit in that same chair by the window, staring at a garden he used to love. George was 71. Spent his whole working life as a carpenter. The kind of man who fixed things, built things, kept everything around him in order. But grief does something strange to people like that. It takes the one thing they cannot fix and puts it right in the center of their chest. And George had no idea what to do with that. Emma had tried everything. Sunday dinners, old movies, long drives through the countryside near their home in rural Somerset, England. Nothing landed. Her father would go through the motions, nod at the right moments, say thank you, then drift back to that chair. His doctor had mentioned something called early memory confusion, which was a gentle way of saying that grief and age together were starting to blur things for George. Not full dementia, not yet, but the edges of his days were getting soft. He would forget what he had for breakfast. Sometimes he would call Emma by her mother's name. Little things. Quiet things. The kind you notice but try not to mention. Emma worked as a volunteer coordinator for a wildlife sanctuary about 40 minutes from their house. It was not a glamorous job. It involved a lot of paperwork, a lot of animal feed schedules, and a lot of phone calls at odd hours. But she loved it, and on most days it was the one place where she felt like things made sense. That changed on a Thursday afternoon when the sanctuary's head vet, a sharp and practical woman named Dr. Carol Vance, knocked on Emma's office door with a look on her face that meant something had gone wrong. The sanctuary had taken in a baby elephant 3 weeks earlier. His name in their records was Ebo. He was 4 months old, barely over 2 feet tall at the shoulder, and had been found alone near a water source in Kenya before being transferred to the UK through a wildlife conservation program. He was small for his age, recovering slowly, and needed round-the-clock care that the sanctuary's main unit could no longer provide because of a burst pipe that had flooded half the building. They needed somewhere safe for Ebo to stay for 2 weeks. Somewhere with space, warmth, and someone medically capable of watching over him at night. Dr. Vance looked at Emma and said nothing. She did not need to. Emma drove home that evening with a trailer attached to her car and a plan she had absolutely no idea how to explain to her father. George was asleep in his chair when Emma got home. The television was on but muted, throwing blue light across his face. His reading glasses had slipped to the end of his nose and there was a cold cup of tea on the side table next to him. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment just watching him breathe. She had rehearsed what to say during the entire drive home. She had tried 6 different versions. All of them fell apart somewhere around the part where she had to explain that a baby elephant was currently in a trailer in their driveway. She decided not to wake him. Instead she went outside with Dr. Carol and 2 sanctuary workers and they spent the next hour setting up the old stone barn at the back of their property. Emma's family had kept horses there years ago when she was a child, so the space was solid, dry, and big enough. They laid down thick bedding, set up 2 heating lamps in the corner, filled a large bucket with fresh water, and sectioned off a sleeping area with low wooden panels that Ebo could not knock over but also could not get hurt on. Ebo was calm during all of this. Surprisingly calm. He stood in the center of the barn and looked around with these enormous brown eyes like he was simply taking notes. His trunk moved slowly near the ground, sniffing the hay, the wood, the air. He was tiny. That was the thing Emma kept coming back to. She had worked near elephants before at the sanctuary but always the older ones. Ebo looked less like a wild animal and more like something a child had drawn, all rounded edges and oversized ears and a trunk that seemed slightly too long for his body. Dr. Carroll ran through the feeding schedule one more time before leaving. Specialist milk formula every 4 hours, fresh greens in the afternoon, temperature checks twice a day, and call her immediately if Ebo showed any signs of stress. She handed Emma a folder, gave Ebo one last look, and then the truck pulled away and it was just Emma and the baby elephant alone in the barn. She sat down on a hay bale and looked at him. He walked over and touched her knee with the tip of his trunk. Emma laughed for the first time in weeks. She stayed with him until almost midnight, then went inside, locked the barn gently, and went to bed with her phone alarm set for every 4 hours. She never told her father. Her plan was to introduce them slowly in the morning. Calmly. With a proper explanation. She would sit George down over breakfast, use simple words, make sure he understood what was in the barn and why, and that everything was fine and safe and temporary. That was the plan. George woke up at 5:45 in the morning and went straight to the kitchen to make tea. The kitchen window faced the back garden and the barn sat maybe 30 meters from the house. George filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stood there waiting for it to boil the way he always did, both hands on the counter, eyes drifting outside. The barn door had swung open slightly overnight. Not wide, just enough. And Ebo, curious as any 4-month-old creature on earth, had wandered out into the early morning and was standing in the garden pulling at the grass with his trunk. George leaned forward and squinted. His eyesight had gotten worse over the past year. He wore glasses for reading but refused to wear them outside because he said they made him feel old, which Emma found both frustrating and quietly funny. So he stood there at the window, no glasses, early morning light still gray and soft, looking at this small gray creature moving slowly across his garden. He tilted his head. It was about the size of a large dog. Moving slowly. Round in shape. Ears that flopped a little when it moved. George had grown up with dogs his whole life. Labradors mostly. He understood dogs the way he understood wood grain and weather, instinctively, without having to think about it. And his brain, which had been getting a little foggy at the edges lately, did what foggy brains often do. It reached for the nearest familiar thing and held on. He nodded to himself, turned off the kettle, put on his boots and jacket and went outside. Ebo heard the back door and turned around. They stood about 10 meters apart, the old man and the baby elephant, both completely still. George's hands were loose at his sides. Ebo's trunk was raised slightly, reading the air. George crouched down slowly, the way he always did when meeting a new dog for the first time, and held out his hand palm up. He said quietly, "Come on then." Ebo walked straight to him. The trunk touched his palm and George's entire face changed. The tension that had lived in his jaw and around his eyes for 4 months just left. He let out a long breath and his hand moved up slowly and rested on the side of Ebo's head. He said, "You're a big lad, aren't you?" Emma found them 40 minutes later. She had woken up at 6:30 for Ebo's morning check and gone straight to the barn still half asleep, only to find the door open and the bedding empty. Her heart jumped. She grabbed the folder off the hay bale and ran outside in her socks. She stopped when she reached the garden. Her father was sitting cross-legged on the grass. Ebo was standing beside him, close enough that his side was pressed lightly against George's shoulder. George had one hand resting on Ebo's leg and was talking to him in a low, steady voice, the same tone he used to use when Emma was small and couldn't sleep. She stood there and did not move. George looked up and smiled at her. A real one. The kind she had not seen in 4 months. He said, "Emma, come and meet this dog. He just appeared in the garden this morning. Must have gotten lost." Emma opened her mouth and then closed it again. Her father turned back to Ebo and said, "He's calm though. Good temperament. Reminds me of a dog your uncle used to have, big gray thing, gentle as anything." Emma sat down on the grass next to them. She had prepared an explanation. She had the whole thing ready. But sitting there in the early morning quiet, watching her father stroke the side of a baby elephant with the same careful hands that used to build furniture and fix roof tiles, she could not find a single reason to say any of it. George was present. Fully, completely present in a way he had not been since the funeral. His eyes were clear. His voice was steady. He was asking questions about where the dog might have come from, what breed it could be, whether they should call around to the neighbors. Emma said, "I think he's all right, Dad. I think he just needs somewhere safe for a little while." George nodded like that settled it entirely. He said, "Well, he can stay here then. I'll sort him out." Ebo pushed his trunk gently against George's cheek and George laughed. A full laugh from the chest. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth. She thought, "I'll explain it tomorrow." She did not explain it tomorrow. The 2 weeks passed like something out of a dream. George woke up every morning with a reason to get out of bed. He made a feeding routine, learned exactly which vegetables Ebo preferred, and spent his afternoons sitting in the garden talking to him the way old men talk to dogs, without expecting anything back, just the company. His appetite came back. He started sleeping through the night. Emma would come downstairs some mornings and find him already outside, jacket on, standing next to Ebo in the early light, one hand resting on his back, both of them just watching the garden wake up. She never corrected him. Not once. On the last evening, the sanctuary truck came at 5. George stood in the garden and watched the workers prepare the trailer, and somewhere in those few minutes something shifted in his face. He went quiet. He looked at Ebo for a long time. Then he walked over and placed both hands gently on either side of Ebo's face and looked at him properly. Emma watched her father's expression change slowly. The confusion clearing. Something honest and wide open replacing it. He said softly, "You were never a dog, were you?" Ebo pressed his forehead forward into George's chest. George stood there holding him for a long moment. Then he stepped back, straightened his jacket, and nodded like a man accepting something he had no power over. He said, "You go on then. Go where you're supposed to go." He watched the trailer until it disappeared past the end of the road. Then he turned to Emma and took her hand without saying anything. They stood in the empty garden together. The grass still had a flattened patch where Ebo used to sleep. George did not look away from it for a long time.